Y'all look, you look familiar. I haven't changed a bit either, I know. But for the 2 or 3 people here who I don't know yet, it was a really beautiful fall day in September 2010. I went down to Union Station, climbed on a train, and 3 days later I was in New York. Spent a couple years working for Mayor Michael Bloomberg there, and the last 5 years have been heading up Transit Center, which, like some of your organizations, is actually a startup as well. We're a little different in that we're a philanthropic startup. We started with an endowment, which is a great blessing to be a startup with money, a nonprofit startup. But what we invest in and what we work for is reform of public transportation and transportation in the United States. We do that by investing through grant making with advocates and with people in agencies, really trying to change the way transportation is delivered in this country. So the question of technology comes up an awful lot, and it's important to really be clear about what we're talking about here when we talk about technology. I don't know how many times I've been at conferences recently where people will assert the iPhone has revolutionized transportation, right? You've heard that? And I push back on that. I say, well, I don't actually agree with that, because mostly what they're talking about, almost always when you try to clarify, they're talking about Lyft and Uber, right? And so aside from the fact that only a tiny fraction of the American population has actually used these services, and now these are people who are in major American cities, so it's not insignificant, but it's also not revolutionary in terms of a national scene. And aside from the fact that we're not even sure it's financially viable, the really important issue for our conversation today is that the revolutionary aspects of Lyft and Uber really have nothing at all to do with technology. The really revolutionary aspects of Lyft and Uber really are upending and circumventing the prevailing local regulations and laws that for years artificially suppressed entry and competition in the taxi industry and dictated what the pricing could be. That's the real actual revolution. So whether you use an iPhone to summon a car, or whether it's the old days and you dial 227 1212, remember that? And a woman with cigarette voice would answer the phone after 48 rings, and then they'd eventually say, yeah, somebody will be there half an hour, 48 minutes, whatever it might be. It's all just a matter of how you're summoning the vehicle. That's the difference. It's the menu, not the meal. So let's not mix up the menu for the meal. There's actually got to be a physical service that actually appears in physical reality. The other aspect of physical reality, my colleague John Orcutt, who worked before he joined us with the New York City Department of Transportation, where you live in physical reality an awful lot, and try to allocate street space, which is limited to a number of different uses, and try to maximize it for people. The reality is that cities are dense places. There are, 97,000 jobs in downtown Portland. There's 28,000 students enrolled on this fairly compact campus here. And in terms of getting that number of people to a rather confined place, I got to say, the best technology to do that is actually, it's a 19th century technology. It's called the train. Runs on these steel wheels, steel rails, very little resistance, so for energy and all that, get a couple hundred people on. There's a 20th century technology called the bus. It also carries large numbers of people in relatively small places and in an efficient way. And here's the big technology tip of the day. If we were all going to leave here and go to City Hall, the best transportation technology for that is this amazing thing. It's generally fashioned out of leather, canvas, rubber, and it's called the shoe. It attaches to the human foot. It really extends the range of the human foot, yet you can get a lot further with it than the human foot without the shoe. So there's all kinds of technology. Technology is not really the issue. Seattle is a very tech-savvy place. You think of all the Amazon jobs and Microsoft. Downtown Seattle, 2010 to 2016, added 45,000 jobs during that period. Only added about 2,000 car trips. Well, how did they do that? Well, they didn't do it with Uber and Lyft or autonomous cars. They did it with a whole lot more bus service and a whole lot more train service. So technology in and of itself is not the issue. The revolution that's needed in the world of transportation, the revolution that's really needed is a revolution in governance and institutions, the human side of things. And by governance and agency structure and mission, I'm talking about issues like, what do we subsidize? What modes or what types of trips do we subsidize? And what are we subsidizing today that maybe we want to tax it instead of subsidizing? What do we regulate and what don't we regulate? Really, it comes down to breaking down a binary that we've had in urban transportation in this country for too long that's outdated, that gives Americans only two bad choices right now. We have this thing called public transportation, which consists of government agencies, usually monopolies, using government employees, operating government equipment, and they do pretty much the same thing day after day, year after year, decade after some cases, and again, play an important function. Downtown Portland wouldn't work without it, but doesn't work for a whole lot of trips. Then there's the world of so-called private transportation that consists of privately owned vehicles operated by their owners on socialized rights of way. Well, that's got huge costs, $10,000 to $12,000 per person. If you're making $30,000 off the top of the bat, we're going to tell people in this country you're going to spend a third of it just to have access to society. That's not very just. And there are all kinds of externalities as well, obviously social costs of that system. So the question for us is, does technology enable us to start breaking down that binary and combine aspects of both? So David, what do you think?
Thanks, Dave. So you thought we were going to do a Penn and Teller act here where I was just going to stand there quietly the whole time. So I'm not going to do this slide particularly justice because Nat was here and he had a prettier slide that did it better. What we're looking at here, when you're looking from a transit agency perspective, is our ridership is down across the board. And if you take a look in particular at our bus service, our bus ridership is down almost at every agency in the US. There's a lot of reasons for this, but a big part of this, if you look at this MAPC study that we have, is about 40% of the trips that are coming into Uber and Lyft are coming from public transit. And what we say is they're cannibalizing our riders. They're cannibalizing our riders. First of all, cannibal is a strange metaphor to use there, but they're cannibalizing our riders. They're not our riders. These people are leaving transit because they're getting better service elsewhere.
This competitive pressure could be very good for folks in the public sector. Another bad word that we think gets used too much in the transit is cannibalism is captive rider, and the idea that there are certain people who really don't have any choices. And in fact, they do have choices. They're not necessarily good ones, but they have choices. So that's one thing that we would like to see technology cause agencies to be more customer focused, which again, it's not a matter of technology. It happens all the time in Europe. It's an attitudinal change. The other big shift in agency thinking that can happen because of technology and is happening in Europe and is starting to happen here in the United States. Unfortunately, the Oregon legislature, I think, moved backwards on this issue a little bit, but is using technology to not only forecast demand and respond to demand, but to actually shape demand. And again, I can't underestimate what a big shift in mentality that it would be for our transportation agencies that for years now have focused 99% of the dialogue on the supply side. New things, new lines, widening highways. Well, you know, that may have been appropriate at a time. It's very capital intensive, and the limitations of it now are very clear. Nat Parker talked this morning about induced demand. Millions of examples literally now. I-405 in California spent billions to remove bottlenecks. What happened? Traffic filled up right away. Houston, Texas, 23 lanes, it should be enough. The Katy Highway, what happened? Traffic goes worse after they added the 23rd lane. People are recognizing this in cities around the country. The mayor of Houston actually said, Mayor of Houston, Texas, of all places, said, we're done, no more lanes, this doesn't work. Yesterday, 24 hours ago, just in the last 24 hours, the new mayor of Seattle, been in office 3 months, so she's somebody who's looking forward, said, you know, these streets in downtown, these are public assets, they have a value, we're going to translate that value into an actual price. So places are really getting it. That's why, frankly, it's really baffling. It's disappointing for us Portland fans around the country when we look here and we say, of all places, Portland, Oregon, is about to have its state government impose urban highway widening here. It's kind of unthinkable given your reputation, yet it's happening. Gravest mistake ever imposed on Portland was I-5 on the east bank of the river. Rather than having the state government rectify it, you're actually going to have them make it worse. You're going to have them make 217 worse, 205 worse. That's not the way most progressive places are going. In fact, they're using pricing to really manage demand. It's the only thing that actually works in terms of traffic reduction.
So the question that we're asking is, can technology make transit more entrepreneurial? And we can tear that apart a little bit. There's a couple of ways that we can do that. One is, can transit itself, mass transit, big government agencies become more entrepreneurial? We're trying to do that in Boston by bringing teams in who can actually build something on the inside, because sometimes the best way to break through an agency culture that is hard and is very difficult to break through is to actually bring new blood in there. The other way that we're doing it is figuring out how we begin to contract. So before I worked for Macro Transit, I worked for a microtransit company. I was a CTO of a company called Bridge. Microtransit is what it sounds like. It's smaller buses. And in these smaller buses, there's the promise that they can be more flexible. Bridge had a good run in Boston for a little while. We had some partnerships, for example, with Kansas City and the Kansas City Transit Authority, where we ran in parts of Kansas City. Bridge didn't make it, and when it died, it sold its assets to a company called Tower Transit. Tower Transit is a private bus operator who runs buses in London, in Singapore, and in various pieces of Australia, and they run it for public agencies. Why did they buy this little microtransit startup? They bought it because they realized that they could actually offer better service, that they could have these big macro buses run high-frequency routes that had a lot of density to them, and they could have these little buses run what were lower frequency routes with higher frequency and on-demand service. And between the two of those, they were able to actually win a recent contract in Sydney to do exactly that. And the question is, what does this mean for, who's responsible for it? And who's responsible for that ultimately? Well, Tower Transit is very innovative and we love them. The responsibility lies in the government in Sydney, who actually put out and let out a contract that allowed them to do that. And that's what the public sector needs to do, is to be able to allow this sort of thing to be able to happen. Trip planning is another example. On the right side is what trip planning used to be. On the left side, transit is amazing. We've opened up our data for the last 7 years in Boston. We've had mobile ticketing for the last 5 years. Those things are amazing. But if you think about what trip planning is and you think about the way that we've opened up our data, we haven't done it good enough. We've done the easy part, right? We've told you where our vehicles are. Great, you can see the vehicles. What we haven't done yet is gone to the real hard physical systems. When we think about fare payment requires a lot of physical hardware. If you take a look at an MBTA bus, the cost of putting a fare box onto a bus in Boston is essentially putting a pretty nice SUV. It's $40,000 to $50,000 inside every bus just to collect fares. What we need to be able to do is make that hardware investment, but then allow the APIs that we can build off of that to enable the sort of entrepreneurial spirit, so that rather than it's just us building our own apps, which are very good things and help out a lot of people, it actually allows more of an ecosystem to develop so that you can think about that world, which actually feels like an integrated experience to the customer, where they go, they do their trip planning, they finish everything off, and they do it in one click. They don't enter through buses. The last piece that I want to make before I turn it back over to David is I just want to talk about the data that we get from this. So when we publish data as transit agencies, we get nothing back. We've been publishing open data for the last 7 years, and we get nothing back in return. When you do a search in Google Maps, when you use Transit or Citymapper or anything like that, all of that information is fascinating, right? It says what your full journey looks like. We have none of that. We don't know anything about that. What we can use the data for right now is to actually republish what we're doing and become more transparent. And as we move towards more entrepreneurial services. As we begin to contract more with the rest of the world, we can use that data, in fact, to measure what our contractors are doing. So data ends up being the key there.
So to close, there's evolution and there's revolution. And evolution, phones have changed, trains have changed over time. But what has not changed, and the revolution that we really do need, is the one in governance, the one in our organizations themselves, public as well as private, but especially public, in terms of wiping the slate clean of many of the practices and formulas and funding situations that we've had so far that have produced the system that we have. And particularly, the way that would look to us would be to be able to tap into the dynamism, the innovation that's normally associated with private enterprise. And I'm a progressive. I think the profit motive is a good thing. The profit motive is why we have iPhones and pop-up toasters and cotton gins and all the other great inventions that we have. But harnessing that inventiveness to the public interest. And frankly, in the public sector world, we actually need to reinvigorate that term public interest as well, because quite honestly, many of our transportation agencies are no longer serving that purpose because times have changed. It's particularly important, I think, this week we're marking the 50th anniversary of the loss of Dr. Martin Luther King. And we have to be honest and look at the facts that while phones have changed and trains have changed, some of the structural racism, some of the structural classism, the things that drove Interstate 5 and every other interstate in this system through black neighborhoods, lower income, the whole systems that disadvantage people in terms of barriers to opportunity, those are not a thing of the past. Those are still embedded in many of the practices and structures that we have in this country. And all of those need to change. And if we can change that and align our organizations in a new sense of public mission and public interest, not just about moving vehicles, which is the old way of thinking about it, but public interest in terms of access to opportunity, in terms of cleaner air to breathe, in terms of allowing people to participate in society, in terms of not having 37,000 people killed on the street, including Powell Boulevard, and think that that's acceptable. And if we can make that realignment and tie that to the public interest, that, not the iPhone, that will be the real revolution. So we look forward to the discussion with Andrew here and with you. If Andrew's, that's his cue. Yeah, give him a cue. Yeah. Welcome, Andrew Thien from The Oregonian. There we go.
Have a seat, guys. Anyone in the audience who has questions, we have microphones on both sides of the stage here, so I'm going to ask these guys a few questions, and then we'll dive into the questions from the audience. So, you talked a little bit about incentivizing or government incentives for transportation. What does that look like to create an equitable transportation system for low-income folks and people who might not have access to transit? Do you guys have a sense of what that looks like?
So one of the things that we think about a lot is fare systems, right? Because fare systems are ultimately the one piece that touches each and every customer who uses transit. And equity there means making sure that people have access while we're continuing to move forward. So in Boston, we're starting up a new fare system. And one of the things that we're doing there is, even though we believe that smartphones are amazing and the iPhone has, as David said, revolutionized absolutely everything and changed transportation, that's not enough, and that you still need to be able to give access to issue cards. So one of the things that we're doing there is making sure that we have a tremendous set of places where you can buy cards that happen on the street, where you can, and that's not something, you get used to that in Portland here. That's not something that exists elsewhere, where you can have a set of retail networks so that everyone has access, and that you can have an equitable distribution of those cards. And really what the point of the fare system that we're doing is that we're removing fare payment and cash from on board those vehicles. And by removing things from on board those vehicles, what it allows us to do is to speed up buses. And so ultimately, the point of what we're trying to do isn't to give people equitable access to apps and to technology. We're trying to give them equitable access to get where they're trying to go. And so what we can do on the technology realm is to make sure that the technology, quite frankly, gets the hell out of their way.
I think the consumer-facing parts of it that Dave is talking about are very important, obviously, every day. Those things are much more likely to happen when the decision-making in the governing institutions is reflective of the population being served. And that is still not the case for the most part in terms of when you look at who rides transit and who serves on transit board. In the case of Portland, you don't have a transit board that is locally accountable. It's the state senate sitting in Salem, decides who gets to be on the TriMet board, even though the state senate does not represent, the population that's here and using transit. And I think that's a lack of accountability that leads to the recent observation and concern, and I think valid concern, that lo and behold, there's a sort of this black box about the appointment of the TriMet general manager, and year after year, now decade after decade, it just always happens to be a white male who's well connected to the people. So I think opening up those processes, which means having a locally accountable board, is key to having more inclusive planning. Then you'd also have more inclusive sort of decision making. I'm not pointing the finger at anybody. I point that we all have things in our career we might do again. I mean, right here, in terms of equity, just in terms of equity, we have a rail line that runs from Wilsonville to Beaverton that we spent $180 million on because it was very powerfully, people were in favor. Silicon Forest, 2,000 people a day ride it. Well, there's 10 times that many people who are on the bus, sitting in traffic on Foster Road or Division, and we're not spending $180 million on them. If you look at the profile of who's being underserved. This is still happening today. Inequity in our system is pervasive today.
We're sitting here in Portland. There were the streetcar revolution sparked about 17 years ago. Has that been a success or a failure nationally? Some cities have adopted it, but is that a successful ingredient in the menu of transportation options?
I think it's been a successful ingredient here because the stage was set for it and because the introduction of it was tied to very clear goals as well as financial participation by major property owners. The Pearl District and the South Waterfront would not have happened without the streetcar. The streetcar wouldn't have happened without those developers chipping into it too. I think it's important to put that in context. That's a 15, maybe 20,000 people a day riding it. Again, it's important. Particularly for these land use outcomes. The TriMet bus system, light rail region-wide is 120,000, so it's almost 10 times. And the bus, 180,000 roughly. Right. Portland spent decades building a transit culture and a land use system, and so these pieces fit together much better here. The places that have gone wrong with streetcars, they come and they look at a streetcar like it's a toy, and they think, well, if I just drop this into Cincinnati, where there's none of the supportive factors that I talked about in terms of the other modes and land use, then it's a real failure and a waste of money. So Atlanta, Cincinnati, Washington, they have not been successful, whereas Portland has.
Yeah. It's a little bit, in some ways, irrelevant to an East Coast context where you have built-up cities that, in fact, they were the original. They were the presage of 17 years ago. They were 117 years ago, and that was very successful in building up the cities on the East Coast. The streetcars went away, and now we're dependent upon buses. And so, a big factor that we have to look at is how do we improve buses? And I think that gets to the equity question as well, because ultimately, we take a look at building new infrastructure, and we're looking at subways and our light rail systems, and it's $2 billion for a couple of miles. And that's not really sustainable. Whereas if we can speed up buses, we can do things like dedicated lanes and traffic signal priority and things like shelters, which Portland is a great place. You get very used to these things existing. That doesn't exist elsewhere. Just the very basic infrastructure, I think, is sort of some of the lessons that we can learn. Yeah, I hate that term, low-hanging fruit, but we'll go with it.
We got one question from the audience over here.
Hi. I'm Ian Thompson. I have a few questions. I think some of the things that you guys are just talking about resonated with me, especially around the streetcar aspect and the culture around public transportation, which is something comparatively to Portland that LA does not have, for example. And I think my understanding is that there's an influx of money coming in for the 2028 Olympics that's supposed to change that game, so to speak. And I think that a lot of the things you're talking about up here are going to be very interesting to see over the course of that. I also, perhaps I missed this in the beginning, David, I'd be curious, number one, to understand some of the investments in private companies that Transit Center is making. But also, my last question escaped me, so perhaps I'll just have to listen to that answer first and it'll come back to me.
Sure. Like most foundations, we don't actually invest in private. All our investments are in Vanguard index funds. So when I talk about investments, it's in terms of grant making to other civic organizations and nonprofits. So we don't actually invest in private companies. They're using the term kind of colloquially.
Understood. I guess, so we talked about ride shares. One of the things that I'd be curious about is some of your thoughts on bike shares, as a lot of these bike shares are approaching billion-dollar companies, especially as we're looking at China. They're looking to expand internationally outside of China. I don't know. I mean, I just got to Portland. I believe there were orange bikes that I saw. Maybe I'm mistaken, but San Francisco has a couple of those bike share programs, a couple of scooter programs. Specifically, I'm thinking of Scoot as a mode of transportation. It's something that I'm a big fan of. But I wonder what your thoughts are on the bike share boom as it's going on around the world.
Sure, and I'll take the Los Angeles one too, because that's an important thing for people to hear. It's actually $120 billion that Los Angeles is about to spend, and it's even before the Olympics. The voters voted for that, taxing themselves. More than 2/3 vote yes. And if I were Portland and concerned about future economic competitiveness, I would look at Seattle, which is also in that same election, 2016, voted a $54 billion expansion of their transit system. Denver's probably spent $5 billion in the last 10 years. This is happening all over the country. And TriMet's approach has served well up until this point. Let's cobble together one line at a time. But you need to be talking about more than let's send a line out Barber Boulevard and call it done and we'll see you again in 10 years. You need really systemic, ambitious, system-wide improvement. When you look at the population growth that's coming here and the demographics, other cities are investing big time in transit and they're competing cities with Portland, and you really ought to be looking at what they're doing and upping the ambitions here. Bike share, many of the same conditions apply in terms of density and usage. And in New York, all the studies that we've seen is that not often, but very often the busiest stations are adjacent to subway stations, meaning that you deduce people are using the bike in conjunction with a transit trip.
Sorry to interject, David. What is an ambitious transportation package along the lines of Seattle? What would that look like in Portland?
Well, I think you would set sort of performance measures in terms of we want to have a certain percentage of our population that's within a 5-minute walk of service that comes every 5 minutes. So those sorts of things, and not just be thinking about, well, I want 5 miles that goes to Tualatin or whatever. It's got to be a system-wide sort of mobility benefit that's broadly shared and equitably enjoyed by people in the region. And I think inevitably it implicates the bus system, which is where the majority of the passengers are now. And so to have these buses creeping across in traffic is really doing an injustice to sort of efficiency.
I think we're out of time at this point, sadly. So we could talk about this all day, I think.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.